On March 1st, 2008, AOL quietly severed the final lifeline to Netscape Navigator, ending all official support for the software that had essentially introduced America to the internet. It was a silent death for a former tech empire. Just 13 years earlier, Netscape commanded over 90% of the browser market and triggered a 1995 initial public offering that birthed the modern Silicon Valley. Now, it was reduced to a neglected digital artifact, abandoned by the millions of dial-up users who had once relied on its ship's wheel logo to access the World Wide Web. The paradox was brutal. The pioneer that created the commercial web, inventing the security protocols that made online shopping possible, was ultimately starved to death by the very digital economy it helped build. But the real story of Netscape is not only the story of a discontinued browser, it is the story of how America first learned to go online, and how the future of the internet was stolen not by better technology, but by a better default. Every week, we tell the stories of American devices, platforms, software, stores, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in Silicon Valley in 1994. In the spring of 1994, the American personal computer, a machine designed for one person to use directly, usually sitting on a family desk or in a home office, had finally become a mainstream consumer appliance. Companies like Compaq, IBM, and Gateway were shipping millions of beige desktop towers across the country. They were expensive, heavy, and mostly used for isolated tasks, typing documents, running spreadsheets, or playing games loaded from a CD-ROM. The internet existed, but it was not a place normal Americans visited. It was a cold, text-based network restricted mostly to academic institutions, government researchers, and military servers. To access it, a user had to type obscure command lines on a black screen. There were no pictures, there were no colors, there was no easy way to navigate. For the average consumer walking into a Circuit City or a CompUSA in early 1994 to buy a computer, the internet was an abstract rumor, not a daily habit. This was the American absence. The hardware was sitting in millions of homes, holding the processing power to connect to the world, but it lacked the interface to make that world make sense. The solution began taking shape not in Silicon Valley, but in a computer lab at the University of Illinois. A 22-year-old student named Mark Andreessen, along with a team of programmers, had recently built a piece of software called Mosaic. Mosaic was an early browser, software used to view websites, but it did something revolutionary. Instead of just displaying rigid lines of text, it allowed images to load alongside the words. It introduced clickable hyperlinks. It turned a dark, hostile terminal into a visual, navigable page. For the first time, an American user did not need to know programming languages or network protocols to use the internet. They only needed to point and click a mouse. But Mosaic belonged to the university. Andreessen graduated and moved to California, assuming his time building web software was over. That changed when he met Jim Clark, the wealthy founder of the hardware giant Silicon Graphics. Clark saw that the internet was going to be the next major computing platform, a foundational technology system that other developers, businesses, and users would eventually build their entire digital lives around. He just needed the right software to unlock it. In April 1994, Clark and Andreessen founded a startup in Mountain View, California, initially called Mosaic Communications Corporation. They recruited the original developers from Illinois, setting up a chaotic, pizza-fueled office in the heart of Silicon Valley. Their goal was incredibly ambitious: to build a completely new commercial-grade web browser from scratch, one that would be faster, more stable, and more capable than anything that had come before. But they faced an immediate, fundamental business problem. They were building a company to sell access to a digital world that most of America did not yet know how to reach. In the fall of 1994, the team released the first beta version of their new browser, officially named Netscape Navigator. From a technical standpoint, it was a masterpiece of mid-90s software engineering. Unlike older browsers that made a user wait until an entire web page downloaded before displaying anything, Navigator rendered the page as the data arrived. For an American user sitting at a desk with a 14.4K dial-up modem, a device that let computers send data over standard copper phone lines, announcing its connection with a harsh, static screech. This continuous loading felt like a revelation. A user could start reading text while the images slowly filled in line by line. The interface was designed to be instantly recognizable. The top right corner featured a large, pulsing capital, and hovering over a planetary horizon. When a page was loading, shooting stars flew across that small digital sky. It was a physical, visual indicator that the machine was actually doing something, that it was reaching out across the country and pulling data back into a quiet home office or a university dorm room. But Netscape faced a unique distribution challenge. In 1994, software was physical. It was sold in large, heavy cardboard boxes on the shelves of stores like CompUSA, Egghead Software, and Circuit City. To get Netscape onto American computers, the company had to convince retail buyers to stock it and consumers to pay for it. Yet, Andreessen and his team knew that if they restricted the software entirely to expensive physical boxes, the network would never grow fast enough. They made a decision that would redefine how software was distributed in America. They offered Netscape Navigator as a free digital download for students, educators, and nonprofit researchers, while officially requiring businesses and home users to pay $39 for a license after a trial period. In practice, the digital version was available to anyone who could find it, spreading rapidly across early online message boards and university networks. For those who did not have the bandwidth to download it, Netscape was packaged in a sleek retail box and shipped to mall electronics stores. An American consumer walking down the software aisle would see it sitting on the shelf next to boxed word processors and digital encyclopedias. Buying that box felt like purchasing a ticket to the future. You brought it home, inserted the installation disks, and suddenly, your isolated machine was part of a global network. Within a few months of its release, the numbers were staggering. Navigator was not just popular, it was becoming the default lens through which the country saw this new medium. A beige desktop tower in a suburban living room was suddenly capable of browsing a catalog in New York, reading a newspaper in Chicago, or downloading a sound file from Seattle. The browser was changing the fundamental value of the personal computer. Before Netscape, a computer was only as useful as the software stored on its internal hard drive. After Netscape, the hard drive mattered less. What mattered was the connection and the window that made that connection visible. The software was ready, and the internet was waiting. But to truly build an empire, Netscape had to prove that this new digital frontier could be a place of serious business, not just a novelty. In December 1994, the company released Netscape Navigator 1.0. It was an immediate sensation, rapidly capturing the attention of the early online community. But the engineers at Netscape understood a fundamental flaw in the architecture of the World Wide Web. As originally designed by academic researchers, the web was stateless. It had no memory. Every time an American user clicked a link to load a new page, the server on the other end completely forgot who they were. If the internet was going to become a functional place for commerce and daily life, this was a critical failure. A user could not add an item to a digital shopping cart, click to the next page to keep browsing, and still have that item in the cart. The ecosystem desperately needed memory. To fix this, a Netscape engineer named Lou Montulli invented the cookie, a small text file saved directly on the user's hard drive that allowed a website to remember specific information about the computer communicating with it. It was a quiet, behind-the-scenes technical update, but it fundamentally changed the nature of the internet. It meant that a website could recognize a returning user, keep a user logged into a service, and track behavior across different pages without requiring the user to constantly re-identify themselves. But memory was only one part of the equation. Early web pages were entirely static. They were essentially digital posters. If a user wanted to see a change on the screen, they had to click a link, wait for the dial-up modem to request new data, and watch the entire page reload line by line. Netscape realized that to make the web feel less like a library and more like a software platform, the pages needed to be dynamic. In 1995, Netscape developer Brendan Eich created a new technology called JavaScript, a programming language embedded directly into the browser that allowed web pages to be interactive without constantly communicating with the remote server. Suddenly, drop-down menus could open instantly, forms could verify information before being submitted, and web pages began to behave less like printed documents and more like interactive applications. These innovations were rapidly transforming the browser from a simple viewer into a powerful operating platform. The browser was no longer just displaying the internet, it was executing code. But the most significant breakthrough was still missing. For the internet to truly become an American economic engine, users had to trust it with their money. In early 1995, sending a credit card number across the internet was like shouting it across a crowded public room. The data traveled in plain text, bouncing through multiple academic and telecommunication servers before reaching its destination, entirely visible to anyone who knew how to intercept it. If Netscape wanted the web to become a functional commercial platform, they had to solve this fundamental security problem. Netscape engineers developed the Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, a security protocol that scrambled and encrypted data traveling between a user's browser and a website's server. When an American user navigated to a secure page, a tiny graphic of a closed padlock appeared in the bottom corner of the Netscape window. That small icon was one of the most important psychological breakthroughs in American tech history. It meant that a person sitting at a family computer desk in Ohio could type a credit card number into a web page hosted in California, and the data would travel through a private, secure tunnel. SSL did not just upgrade a piece of software, it practically invented the American e-commerce industry. By the summer of 1995, Netscape was a cultural phenomenon. It had rapidly captured an estimated 80% of the browser market. To fund their massive expansion, the founders made a decision that would permanently alter the financial geography of the country. On August 9, 1995, Netscape Communications went public. Standard Wall Street practice dictated that a company needed years of steady, predictable profits before an initial public offering. Netscape was barely 16 months old and was giving its core consumer product away for free to much of its user base. Traditional investors were deeply skeptical, but when trading opened, the reaction was explosive. Priced initially at $28 a share, the stock rocketed to $75 before closing the day at $58. In a single afternoon, a company with barely any revenue was valued at nearly $3 billion. It was the starting gun for the dot-com boom, forever changing how Silicon Valley startups were funded and valued. For a brief window, the Netscape business model seemed invincible. While students and casual home users downloaded the browser over university networks, corporate America was paying for it. Small businesses and enterprise IT departments bought physical boxes of Netscape Navigator off the shelves of CompUSA, paying $39 for an official license and a printed manual. But the real revenue was on the back end. Netscape sold the highly expensive server software that companies used to host the websites that the browser visited. They were effectively paving both ends of the new digital highway, controlling how information was sent and how it was viewed. Inside the tech industry, the implications of this dominance were staggering. Mark Andreessen famously suggested that Netscape could eventually reduce the underlying operating system to a poorly debugged set of device drivers. The browser, with its own memory, its own programming language, and its own security protocols, was becoming a platform, a technology system that other developers, businesses, and services built around. An American user did not need to care if they were using an IBM desktop, an Apple machine, or a Unix workstation. They only cared about opening the Netscape window. Netscape had successfully built the ultimate application for the internet, but in Redmond, Washington, a much larger empire realized that this new application was about to make their operating system irrelevant. By late 1995 and into 1996, Netscape Navigator was no longer just a popular piece of software. It was the unquestioned gateway to the digital world. The company commanded a staggering market share, hovering around 90%. For the vast majority of the country, Netscape and the internet were effectively the same thing. This dominance reshaped the physical and cultural landscape of American media. Before Netscape, television commercials, magazine advertisements, and billboards ended with a phone number or a physical retail address. But almost overnight, a strange new string of text began appearing at the bottom of movie posters and on the screens of national television commercials. HTTP, Josh Jackers. The web address had arrived in the mainstream. Hollywood studios launching promotional sites, massive retailers testing digital catalogs, and local businesses buying their first domain names all rushed to build websites. And they all designed those sites specifically to be viewed through the lens of Netscape Navigator. In a mid-90s American home, where the beige family computer sat heavily on a shared living room desk, opening the browser was not just launching an application. It was the defining ritual of going online. The mechanical screech and static hiss of a U.S. robotics dial-up modem connecting to the local phone line was the overture. The double click on the large ship's wheel and icon was the main event. That single software window decided who could read the daily news, who could chat on early message boards, who could research a high school paper, and who felt that the future had finally arrived in their house. The software's reach extended far beyond the family desk. In university computer labs across the country, rows of heavy CRT monitors all displayed the same pulsing planetary logo in the top right corner. On the trading floors of Wall Street, financial analysts used Netscape to pull real-time data from early web portals. In the software aisles of CompUSA, Egghead Software, and Best Buy, the physical cardboard boxes of Netscape Navigator stacked on the shelves represented the most coveted digital real estate in the retail market. Millions of Americans were willing to pay $39 for a boxed copy because it was the only reliable vehicle for the information superhighway. Internet service providers. The regional and national companies like Earthlink, Netcom, and local telecom carriers that sold dial-up access by the hour frequently bundled Netscape installation floppy disks with their connection kits. When an American user signed up for a new internet plan, the software they used to explore it was almost always predetermined. The sheer scale of this user base gave Netscape a terrifying amount of structural power in the technology industry. They were dictating the standards of the web through sheer momentum. If Netscape engineers decided to invent a new HTML tag, a piece of underlying code that changed how text, colors, or images were displayed, web developers across the country immediately adopted it. They had to. If a website did not load correctly on Navigator, it practically did not exist to the consumer market. This created a massive network effect, the pattern where a platform becomes more valuable as more people and developers use it. Webmasters put small, best viewed with Netscape graphics at the bottom of their homepages, acting as free billboards across the internet. A developer sitting in a cramped Silicon Valley startup office no longer cared if the end user had a Microsoft Windows desktop, an Apple Macintosh, or a high-end Unix workstation. The underlying hardware and operating system were suddenly irrelevant. As long as the machine could run Netscape, the blockchain is ender, the developer could reach the user. Inside Netscape's rapidly expanding headquarters in Mountain View, California, the atmosphere was a mix of intense engineering rigor and rock-star hubris. The company was hiring the best programmers in the country, expanding its server software business to massive enterprise clients, and continually pushing out new versions of the browser with more features and capabilities. They believed they were not just building a product, but architecting the permanent infrastructure of the new digital economy. The browser was acting as a universal translator, and in the process, it was threatening to turn the computer itself into a dumb terminal. By 1996, Netscape was no longer just a window to the web. It was attempting to become the entire operating environment. The company released Netscape Communicator, a massive software suite that included not just the Navigator browser, but an email client, a newsgroup reader, and a web authoring tool that let users build their own basic pages. For an American office worker sitting in a carpeted cubicle, this meant the Netscape application never had to be minimized. You checked your morning email, read company memos, and browsed external databases all within the same interface. The underlying Microsoft Windows or Apple Macintosh operating system was effectively hidden, reduced to a mere engine running quietly in the background. Netscape was actively trying to trap the user inside its own digital borders, making the computer's actual operating system feel irrelevant. The financial engine powering this ambition was staggering. Netscape was selling expensive server software to Fortune 500 companies, convincing corporate IT departments that the future of data storage and internal communication was on the web. In February 1996, Mark Andreessen appeared barefoot on the cover of Time magazine, seated on a digital throne. It was the ultimate visual symbol of American dot-com hubris, a 24-year-old engineer who had seemingly bypassed the traditional hardware titans to build a new empire out of pure code. The developer ecosystem, the network of independent programmers and companies building websites, was entirely captive to Netscape's momentum. If Netscape introduced a new feature, web developers instantly adopted it. If they created a new way to display moving text or play a sound file, it became the industry standard overnight. In startup offices across Silicon Valley, engineers designed their platforms exclusively for the N icon. The browser had effectively become a monopoly, not through aggressive business tactics, but through sheer technological speed. They were moving too fast for anyone else to catch up. But this explosive growth masked a structural vulnerability in their business model. Netscape's consumer revenue still relied heavily on the traditional retail system. They were selling physical cardboard boxes on the shelves of CompUSA, Best Buy, and Circuit City for $39. For those who did not buy the box, acquiring the software digitally was a chore. Downloading a 10-megabyte browser installation file in 1996 over a 28.8K dial-up modem was not a trivial task. It could take over an hour of tying up the family phone line, hoping nobody picked up a receiver in the kitchen and severed the fragile connection. That friction was a massive blind spot. Netscape was a company playing by the old rules of retail distribution, assuming that users would always actively seek out their product, spend the money, or endure the long download simply because it was the best technology available. The executives in Mountain View believed they were invincible. They assumed that a superior product would naturally maintain its dominance. But they were ignoring the brutal physics of American technology distribution. A consumer buying a new gateway or compact computer in a mall electronics store did not care about elegant code architecture or developer APIs. They just wanted to go online as quickly and easily as possible. Netscape had built a magnificent application. They had defined the culture of the early internet. They had proven that the web could be a secure, dynamic, and wildly profitable place. The browser had conquered the American desktop, but it was still a piece of software that people had to choose to install, and that single step would soon become its undoing. The first crack in Netscape's empire was not a massive server failure, a sudden exodus of users, or a flaw in the code. It was a simple, quiet price tag. In August 1996, Microsoft released Internet Explorer 3.0. Up until that point, Microsoft's browser had been widely dismissed inside Silicon Valley. The early versions were clunky, slow, and severely lacking in features compared to Navigator. But version 3.0 was different. It caught up technically, supporting new web standards and its own version of JavaScript. But the code was not the weapon. The weapon was the cost. Microsoft made Internet Explorer 3.0 completely free for everyone, not just students and researchers, but home users and corporate businesses as well. Netscape was still relying heavily on retail software sales. They were charging American consumers $39 for a physical cardboard box in the software aisle of mall electronics stores, and they were charging corporate IT departments millions for enterprise licenses. Microsoft, sitting on massive cash reserves generated by the Windows operating system, did not need to make a single dollar directly from its browser. They could afford to bleed money indefinitely just to take away Netscape's oxygen. This was the brutal reality of the second American tech market force: retail, distribution, defaults, and platform access. An American technology product did not only have to be good, it had to survive where Americans found technology. Netscape's entire business model relied on a user actively choosing to seek out their browser, either by spending an hour downloading it over a slow dial-up connection or driving to a store to buy it. Microsoft realized they could intercept the user before that choice was ever made. The problem was not the software itself. The problem was the ecosystem around it. Netscape was trying to sell a product. Microsoft was trying to protect a platform. In Redmond, Washington, Microsoft executives understood that if Netscape continued to grow into its own operating environment, developers would stop writing applications for Windows and start writing them entirely for the web. If that happened, Windows would become nothing more than a background utility, a set of device drivers. To stop that, they had to destroy the Netscape habit. The true systemic collapse began a year later, in October 1997, with the release of Internet Explorer 4.0. On the night it launched, a group of Microsoft engineers drove down to Netscape's headquarters in Mountain View and dumped a massive 10-foot-tall metal statue of the Internet Explorer E logo right on the front lawn. Netscape employees found it the next morning, knocked it over, and placed their own dinosaur mascot on top of it. It was a defiant, humorous response, but the reality inside the building was growing grim. Microsoft did not just release a new application, they fundamentally altered the architecture of the personal computer. They integrated the Internet Explorer code directly into the Windows operating system itself. When an American user turned on a new PC, the web browser was no longer a separate program they had to launch. It was baked into the File Explorer, the help menus, and the desktop itself. The iconic blue E was pinned permanently to the taskbar. The retail shelf changed immediately. Microsoft used its immense leverage over computer manufacturers, companies like Compaq, Gateway, and IBM, to enforce this new reality. These hardware companies operated on razor-thin profit margins. They needed to pre-install Windows on their beige desktop towers because no American consumer would buy a machine without it. Microsoft used this leverage to dictate the terms of the desktop screen. If a manufacturer wanted the Windows license, they were heavily pressured to feature the Internet Explorer icon prominently, and in some cases to hide or remove the Netscape icon entirely. For a family buying a new computer at Circuit City or Best Buy in 1998, the impact was immediate. They brought the heavy boxes home, plugged the monitor into the tower, and connected the phone line to the modem. When the screen flickered on, they did not have to drive to CompUSA to buy a $39 piece of software. They did not have to wait for a long download. A blue E was already sitting there, waiting for a double click. The sheer convenience of a built-in default was an overwhelming force. Then came the deals that locked Netscape out of the largest remaining channels. America Online, or AOL, was the most popular online service in the country, mailing millions of free installation CD-ROMs to American households to get them connected to the web. Netscape desperately wanted AOL to use Navigator as its built-in browser, but Microsoft offered AOL something Netscape could not: prime real estate on the Windows desktop. In exchange for a dedicated AOL folder on millions of new PCs, AOL agreed to use the Internet Explorer rendering engine for its service. Overnight, millions of American dial-up users were quietly shifted off Netscape technology without even realizing it. Netscape still had a superior product and a fiercely loyal developer community, but the rules of the American tech market had fundamentally changed. The browser wars were no longer a battle of engineering. They had become a war of distribution, and Netscape was fighting a rival that owned the battlefield. In May 1998, the United States government finally stepped in. The Department of Justice, along with 20 states, filed a massive antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft. The core of the government's argument was exactly what Netscape had been screaming for years: that Microsoft was illegally using its monopoly over the Windows operating system to crush competing software. The trial became a national media spectacle. American television networks broadcast footage of lawyers arguing over the definition of an operating system, trying to determine if a web browser was a separate product or an integrated feature. But in the technology market, a courtroom timeline is a death sentence. The legal system moved in years, while the internet moved in months. As the trial dragged on, Netscape was bleeding market share at an apocalyptic rate. Every day, thousands of new American consumers bought their first computers, took them home, connected their dial-up modems, and clicked the built-in Internet Explorer icon, simply because it was there. Desperate to survive, Netscape executives made a radical pivot. In January 1998, they announced that Netscape Navigator would be entirely free for everyone, abandoning the $39 retail price entirely. The cardboard boxes sitting on the shelves of CompUSA and Circuit City were suddenly obsolete, but they went one step further. They announced they were open-sourcing the browser's code. They took the proprietary engineering that had birthed the commercial internet, packaged it into a project called Mozilla, and gave it away to the global developer community. It was a profound, industry-shaking decision, but as a business strategy to save the immediate company, it was a massive surrender. They had conceded that they could no longer beat Microsoft on distribution or revenue. By late 1998, the independent Silicon Valley empire that had ignited the dot-com boom was out of options. On November 24, 1998, America Online announced it was acquiring Netscape Communications for $4.2 billion in stock. On paper, it sounded like a massive victory. But inside the tech industry, everyone understood it was a rescue mission. This was the final blow of the fifth American tech market force: corporate consolidation, brand survival, and cultural memory. AOL did not buy Netscape because they wanted to build a better browser. AOL was a dial-up service company. They bought Netscape for its server software business, its massive web portal traffic, and its brand leverage against Microsoft. The fiercely independent engineering culture in Mountain View evaporated. The original founders and top developers quietly began to leave. The company that had once threatened to replace the entire computer operating system was now just a subsidiary of an internet service provider. The decline accelerated rapidly in the early 2000s. Without its visionary leadership and starved of independent resources, the Netscape browser became slow, bloated, and unstable. Updates were delayed. The software became cluttered with AOL toolbars, promotional links, and unnecessary features. For the remaining loyal users sitting at their home desks, opening Netscape no longer felt like stepping into the future. It felt like opening a digital billboard. Web developers, who had once optimized every line of code for Netscape, stopped caring. The network effect had completely reversed. Because 95% of the country was now using Internet Explorer, webmasters designed their sites exclusively for Microsoft's rendering engine. If an American user stubbornly held onto Netscape and tried to load a modern web page in 2002, the text would often misalign, the images would break, and the drop-down menus would fail. The Internet itself was actively rejecting the browser that had created it. Even after the Department of Justice successfully proved that Microsoft had engaged in illegal monopoly maintenance, it did not matter to Netscape. A judge could order Microsoft to change its future business practices, but a judge could not force millions of American users to change their daily digital habits. The government won the argument. Microsoft won the Internet. In 2003, AOL disbanded the Netscape development team entirely, firing the remaining engineers and handing the underlying code over to the non-profit Mozilla Foundation. The Netscape name survived for a few more years, reduced to a hollow brand stamped on a low-cost dial-up internet service and a few minor software updates built on other people's code. The software that had brought America online had been reduced to a ghost. The default shifted. The distribution failed. The users moved. The developers followed. The company sold. The brand survived. The empire collapsed. When AOL officially discontinued Netscape Navigator on March 1, 2008, the software that had introduced America to the Internet was quietly laid to rest. There was no grand ceremony, no national broadcast, and no sudden crash of global networks. The servers simply stopped offering updates. The few remaining loyalists who still had the application installed on their older desktop machines were gently advised to download Mozilla Firefox or another modern browser. The N icon, once the most powerful symbol of the American digital economy, was finally relegated to the archives of digital history. But looking at the death of the brand is the wrong way to measure the legacy of the company. Netscape died as a commercial retail product, but its ghost had already possessed a new vessel. The radical decision in 1998 to open source the Navigator code, to give away the underlying engineering to the global public, birthed the Mozilla Project. From the ashes of that code base, a community of independent developers and former Netscape engineers built a new browser. In 2004, they launched Mozilla Firefox. When Firefox debuted, it did not have the financial backing of a massive corporation. Instead, thousands of American internet users and developers pooled their money to buy a two-page advertisement in the New York Times, proudly listing their names to announce that an alternative to Internet Explorer had finally returned. Firefox would go on to slowly chip away at Microsoft's monopoly, proving that an independent open web browser could survive against a built-in default. This is not mere nostalgia. To understand the true weight of Netscape's survival, you do not look at old screenshots. You look at the fundamental architecture of the modern web. Every time a modern American user opens a complex web application, checks out on an e-commerce site, interacts with a dynamic social media feed, or watches a video player load seamlessly inside a browser, they are relying on JavaScript. The programming language that developer Brendan Eich wrote in a frantic 10-day sprint in 1995 for Netscape is now the foundational nervous system of the entire Internet. It is arguably the most widely used programming language on the planet, executing billions of times a second on smartphones, laptops, and massive cloud servers, computers that provide data and services to other machines. Netscape is gone, but its language rustringe runs the world. The same is true for the security protocols they invented. The Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, which Netscape introduced to stop credit card numbers from being intercepted in plain text, evolved into the universal security standard that currently protects the global digital economy. The small padlock icon they pioneered remains the universal symbol of online trust. They did not just build a window, they built the plumbing, the locks, and the foundation of the commercial internet. Even in the legal realm, the legacy of Netscape's defeat set the boundaries for the modern technology industry. The Department of Justice antitrust trial against Microsoft, sparked largely by the destruction of Netscape, established a massive legal precedent regarding how technology monopolies are allowed to use platform leverage. Decades later, when modern tech empires face government scrutiny over App Store policies, search engine defaults, and digital ecosystems, the legal framework traces directly back to the browser wars of the late 1990s. Today, the physical artifacts of the Netscape empire are preserved by a dedicated community of computing historians and vintage technology collectors. Inside the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, just miles from where the chaotic early startup office once stood, Netscape is documented not as a failed business, but as the spark that ignited the information age. Online, communities of retro computing enthusiasts spend their weekends restoring old beige desktop towers, replacing dead hard drives, and reinstalling Windows 95. They load up archive sites just to download an original copy of Netscape Navigator 3.0. They do this not because it is useful, but because they want to preserve the specific mechanical feeling of the early internet. They want to hear the screech of the dial-up modem, see the shooting stars fly across the pulsing N logo, and remember a time when going online was a deliberate destination rather than a constant, inescapable background condition. The paradox of Netscape is that it won the war for the internet while losing the war for the desktop. It taught America that software did not need to be bound to a local machine. It proved that the network was the computer. It died because it was forced to fight as a retail product in a physical store against an opponent that controlled the operating system waiting at home. Somewhere on the dusty shelf of an American thrift store, tucked between outdated encyclopedias, tangled cables, and discarded tax software, sits a faded, shrink-wrapped cardboard box. Inside is a heavy instruction manual and a plastic CD-ROM containing Netscape Navigator, a silent artifact that once held the entire future of the internet. See you in the next video.